Okay, so tell me about the time when you got hurt.
All right, I'm John Barber, living in Eugene, Oregon, and I'm 96 years old. When I was a little boy and living in Omaha with my parents, I decided I wanted to work on a boat, and I was only about 7 or 8 years old. And so I got a hold of a board, and I was cutting on this board to make the bow on this ship that I was building. Somehow or another, this saw slipped out of the board and cut me very badly on my thumb, which I could show you, but it isn't available at this time. I didn't know what to do, so I went home, and nobody was at my folks' home. So I got a rag and wrapped it around my hand, and then I went down to the streetcar. Now, in those days, the streetcars were run by electricity and not by power like we have at present time. It took the streetcar about, I would say 15 minutes. In the meantime, I had this big rag around my hand, and I went to the family doctor. The family doctor didn't know anything about it, but she decided, it was a lady, she decided that she better sew it up. So she took the rag off, and she sewed up this big cut that I had on my hand. And then after she had got the stitches in and everything was all set, then I had the job of getting back home, which I finally did. And it took quite a little while. The streetcars were about 15 minutes apart, and I had to wait for the streetcar. And then I went home, and still nobody at home, so I just waited until my parents came. And when they came home, they were so surprised to see me sitting there with this great big bandage on my hand. They had no idea what had happened, and I was sort of in a state of shock. But in any event, when I got on the streetcar in Omaha, Nebraska, and went back to my parents' house, it probably took at least 15 minutes to get there. And now to this day, I have a rather severe scar in my thumb, which shows the extent of my injury. But it was quite a traumatic experience for a little boy, 8 or 9 years old, to get on the streetcar with this cut hand and have it sewed up. I don't remember her ever giving me any antibiotics or any of that kind of stuff, because that was all unknown at that time, and she didn't give me any shots to reduce the pain. She just sewed it up. And so that's one of the experiences of growing up. And it was quite a while before I started cutting the front of a board to make the bow on a boat. Now that's the end of this story.
How did you come to start working on the boat by yourself?
Well, I went down to the neighbor's house, and somehow or another there weren't anybody there, but it was probably in the garage. And I had a hand saw, and it wasn't very sharp. And it was an experience that I had to meet myself, and I did the best I could.
And who told you that you could work on this job?
Oh, the neighbor boy, but they weren't there. Oh. We were building this whole boat together, but nobody was home at their house. I was there all alone.
And how come you decided to go and work on that boat by yourself?
Well, I had nothing else to do. Okay. We had to build this little boat to sail in our neighborhood there, and that was my project at that time.
Uh-huh. And where were your folks at this time?
I can't remember that. My father was out of town, and my mother apparently was downtown shopping. And none of my sisters were home. I was there all alone.
Huh. And how old were you again?
Well, I was somewhere between 7 and 9 years old. I was a little boy.
So you got on the streetcar.
Yeah. I had to walk about 2 blocks to the streetcar. Okay. And then the streetcar eventually came, and I, of course, stopped the streetcar and got on the streetcar. I suppose I had enough money to pay my fare on the car. In any event, there's only a thing I could do. In those days, we didn't have automobiles like we do now. And as I remember, we even had fire engines there at that time that were pulled by horses. So that's kind of the primitive neighborhood that I lived in.
Now, your folks, your parents, um, did they let you take care of yourself pretty often?
Well, I was an ambitious kid. I used to do a lot of buying and selling of vegetables and eggs, and I sold asparagus, and I had a newspaper route at 9. When I was 9 years old, I had a newspaper route, and I used to go out in the country and cut asparagus and bring it into town. I got the asparagus for nothing, and I'd put a rubber band around it, then I'd sell it in the neighborhood. I also used to buy eggs from my uncle on a farm up north of Omaha, about 80 miles, and he would ship the eggs to me, and then I would bring them home and I would sell those eggs to in the neighborhood. So much, and I would get a profit of about 100% on those eggs, and they were quite fresh eggs, and I used to get 24 dozen. It was in each egg crate, and peddle them in the neighborhood. And every time anybody saw me coming, they knew they had to buy something to get rid of me. But I was always buying and selling something. And I used to sell the Saturday Evening Post. Then, of course, it was abandoned later, but I used to sell that. And when I was 9 years old, they were beginning to talk about a war, the First World War. And when I was, I think I was about 9 or 10 when the war started, and I was carrying papers, and the papers weren't very big at that time. They were, and I had a route of 100 people, and I carried those on my back to the various customers. And then on Saturdays, I had to take the time to go around and collect for my papers. And that wasn't easy because everybody in that neighborhood had a dog. And since I'd been kept throwing these newspapers on the porches, the dogs also always saw me coming, and they scared the heck out of me. So Saturday, I had some way or another to get to those porches to collect for my papers. But that was just one of the many things that I did as a boy. Now, my brother, who was 2 years younger, he wasn't very ambitious as far as making money is concerned. He was home working on an old car that we had, that we had together.
How old were you when you were working on that car?
9 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, I bet you could drive as a little kid.
Well, I didn't do much driving.
No, okay.
But in those days, I don't remember, but I don't think we had driver's licenses.
Yeah.
And you could drive if you were able. And when I was 16 and my brother was 14, we had an old car, and I had an uncle that was going to get married at West Point, Nebraska, who was the father of Warren Buffett in West Point, Nebraska. My brother and I drove clear up to West Point, Nebraska to attend the funeral. I mean the wedding. And they didn't know we were coming. So when we got there, they just put us up in the attic upstairs, and that's where we slept for 2 or 3 days. In the meantime, Warren Buffett's father and mother got married, and then we left and went back home. But this little old car, it must have been, it was in the middle of winter time. It was around first of the year, and it was pretty cold driving that old car. There weren't very many cars around, and the roads were not paved. But we made it up there and back to the wedding. But now that we went to the wedding of the father and mother of Warren Buffett, who is now the most wealthy man in the world. That was quite an experience.
And then, did you know Warren Buffett when he was little?
Yes. When I was quite a little older than he,
Yeah.
and I knew him when he was a boy, and he was at one time he was back in. When I knew him, he was back in Virginia, and we were there, and he was carrying papers.
Did you teach him how to buy and sell stuff?
What?
Did you teach him how to buy and sell stuff?
He learned pretty fast. And anyhow, he had a paper route. And this paper route was kind of interesting because it was in Washington, D.C. And his father was the congressman from Omaha, and he soon devised the idea of buying a bunch of papers and then having some other kids deliver them. And that was his, as far as I know, that was his first business experience.
Yeah.
But I learned, and I have several letters from him now, kind of reminiscing of what we did at those days.
Can you tell me a little bit about your mother and your father and how they ended up in Omaha?
Well, my mother and father, my father was from Bancroft, Nebraska, and I believe my mother was too. They were married. He was a school teacher. They decided to move from Bancroft to Omaha. He became a real estate appraiser and later became a trust officer of the bank.
Okay.
And my mother was raising 6 children, so she was pretty busy. They lived in one street for about 2 years, and then they moved to another town, another street, and they stayed on that street for about 20 years. And then they decided to, then we all moved away, and my mother and my sister and my father moved into a smaller house on the edge of town.
What was your father's name?
John.
Oh,
yeah,
that's right.
same as mine.
Yeah. And your mother's name?
Edith
And what was her maiden name?
Hobbs,
Okay.
Hobbs.
Oh.
Her father was a grocery store owner and operator in Omaha. But they all came from Bancroft, Nebraska, and my father's father owned the farm where the railroad came through, so they decided to call it Bancroft, and that was what his name was. So they named it town Bancroft.
That's pretty remarkable.
What?
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. It was a very rich country, good crops, never was in the drought area, and most always had plenty of rain. And it's a good place to live.
Now, your dad, let's see, your dad worked as an accountant or what?
No, my father was a real estate man and later became a bank trustee. He was trustee in a bank, and his main job was to look after loans for the Metropolitan Insurance Company, who handled the loans through the U.S. National Bank.
Okay.
And he worked for the bank.
So did he track debtors?
What?
Did he track debtors? Did
Oh,
he kind of keep track of who was making their payments and who wasn't?
Oh, he looked after the farms for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. The bank was trustee for the Metropolitan Life, and he was an employee.
Okay.
And he had, this might interest you, he had 2 old Model T Fords that he drove around over the country, and he would always drive one and leave one at home. Then the one at home, my brother and I used to play with it and drive it. And one day we had an accident, and oh, it was exciting. He was gone. He didn't know about it. So we went home and told our mother that we had this accident, and she got us right down to the repair shop, and we got the car all repaired by the time my father got back home. And boy, we're really relieved, because that old Ford, that old Model T, belonged to the bank, not to my father.
Both belonged to the bank.
What?
Did both cars belong to the bank?
Yes, and in those days they didn't run very good, and so he would drive one until it was kind of worn out or needed repair, and then he'd drive the other one and have the other one that he'd been driving repaired. And he'd drive all over the state of Nebraska looking after these farms for the Metropolitan Life Insurance.
And so you thought you'd give a hand at repairing one of those.
Yeah, that's right.
So it sounds like your mother kind of covered for you a little.
Oh, my mother she was on our side. She saw to it that we didn't get into trouble.
What was her name?
My name?
Her name?
Oh, Edith.
Edith. And what was her maiden name?
Edith Hobbs.
Edith Hobbs. And your dad was John Barber, right?
Right.
All right.
John Lawrence Barber, same as mine was. And in my younger years, because our names were the same, people used to call me Lawrence instead of John. But we changed that after a while.
What was your brother's middle name?
Hobbs
So Leonard Hobbs Barber.
Barber, yeah.
Okay.
And he got his name from my mother's maiden name. Now, do you want
So
to
did
hear?
I. So did I, because I've got.
Do you want to hear another story?
I want to, and I'm going to stop the tape now,
All right.
and then I'm going to have you tell me that later.
I've
I've been wanting to do this for a while.
got an
Because I got all
interesting.
these stories that I know, and you know what? The funny thing is that you've
On Sunday, she'd throw all the clothes from all the kids down the clothes chute, and then she'd sort it in the basement. Then she'd get up early Monday morning and start washing, and she was washing all day long. And she had rather poor equipment, but she got the job done. And then, of course, there was the old story about washing on Monday and ironing on Tuesday and cleaning on Wednesday. And she didn't have, we had a good house, but she didn't have a lot of modern equipment. And we had a sink, an ordinary sink. And I don't remember whether we had a hot water tank, but she would fill a tank or a wash pan with hot water, move it over on a table, wash the dishes, then put it over in another pan and dry them, or somebody else would dry them. But we'd always have to help with the dishes. And then on, this is different, but when we were in school, my mother was a very smart woman, and we'd all come downstairs with our problems at school. And while she was getting breakfast, and she was busy, why, we'd have her help us with our algebra or our Latin or something. She'd always help us. My dad never helped us, but my mother did. She was the leader of the pack.
Now, I remembered you used to talk about how you would help with the laundry, but Leonard didn't help that much with the laundry. Do you remember
he
that?
was out, most of the time he was out working in the garage on an old car or something.
Uh-huh.
He never helped much with the housework.
Uh-huh. But the laundry included, did she use a washboard and then a wringer?
We had an old-fashioned washing machine,
Oh, really? Okay.
and she used that.
Okay.
But the dirty clothes, she would wash on an ironing board, and she never sent things to the cleaners.
Yeah.
There was no such thing. She used to wash my dad's pants in a pan of kerosene or gasoline, then she'd rinse them, and then finally she'd press them. But she always, and all of us, she took care of our clothes.
Yeah.
And we always, I don't remember the family ever going out for dinner. I don't think we ever did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My father would oftentimes bring stuff home for dinner, but we would buy it in a little grocery store there. For a while we bought it from her father's store, and he closed the store and moved to Sacramento.
Oh, okay. He moved to Sacramento, and you don't know what happened?
He moved to Sacramento,
Uh-huh.
and that's another story. Well, my father used to buy old houses in the neighborhood, the colored people's neighborhood, and he had a big old house. And one day he asked my brother and I to go down and collect the rent. The rent that was due was $35. Well, we had kind of had our idea of a certain old Dodge Coupe that we liked, and so we went down and collected the rent. And without saying anything to my dad about it, we bought that old Dodge out of that rent money, and we bought the Dodge for $35. Well, we had to take it home and do a lot of repairing, but we also had to tell the father where the money went. And he was quite surprised to think that his two kids would go down and buy a car for the rent money, or from the rent money of that old house. Well, we drove that car for many years. Well, not many years, but 2 or 3 years. And among other times, see, I think I was about 16. My brother was 14, and we got it all fixed up. And it was our desire to go to the Black Hills. So we got the car all up in good shape, and we took off and went to the Black Hills. Now that was about 500 or 600 miles away, and we had a lot of fun. But the old car gave us a lot of trouble, and we'd go a couple of 100 miles, and then we'd have to stop and have it repaired. And it seemed like every time we had to stop, we'd have to find a bandstand, because every town up there in northern Nebraska and South Dakota had a bandstand. So we'd sleep in the bandstand while the car was being repaired. Sometimes we stayed in the bandstand for a couple of days. We finally got to the Black Hills, and we had a wonderful time up there driving around over the mountains with our old car. And by the time it had a flat crankshaft, was what the trouble was. And we had the bearings, and we'd have to buy bearings because the flat crankshaft would cause the bearings to wear out. And we finally got it back home again with that old Dodge, and we were awful glad to get rid of it. But that was one of the many experiences that we had. And I, at that time, was 16, and I remember now, and my brother was 14, and he was the mechanic, and I was the driver. And we just had lots of trouble with that old car, but we made it. That's a 1,200-mile trip, and everybody was surprised to think that we'd buy that old car for $35 and drive it that far.
So now, what's a bandstand?
What?
What's a bandstand?
Well, every town in those days had a band, and every Sunday in the summertime they'd have a band concert, and we had no money to go. There was no such things as motels in those days. You either had to sleep outside or find a bandstand or someplace to sleep. Well, we discovered the best way to a place to sleep was in a bandstand.
Now that's under the stage.
It was on the stage underneath the cover. There was a cover.
Right, the stage with the cover, right?
Yes, that's right. And we had sleeping bags, of course.
Okay.
And then we went up to the sun finally got to. And in western South Dakota, the water was real bad. It was very, very tainted with alcohol, or alkali.
Oh,
And we finally got to a town called Kadoka, where there was a drugstore that had decent water. So we stayed there for a couple of days and filled up our jugs with good water. And then we went up to the Black Hills, and we traveled around in the Black Hills quite a bit. And we found a place where we could stay overnight or two, and there was a nice stream running through there. In those days, the Black Hills were not particularly developed. Well, we noticed on this ranch where we were staying that a lot of people were gathering on a Sunday, and we found out that they were bootlegging up there, and they were bootlegging in one building and having the party in another building. And so we got our curiosity satisfied as to what was going on in those two buildings. And then we found an old motorcycle up there, and we repaired it to some extent and rode it a little bit. But our principal food now, it's hard to believe, but we would catch fish with what equipment. And as a matter of fact, the lady in one of those houses gave us some old fishing equipment, and we caught fish, and we filled up on fish. We had lots of fish. And we finally got tired of that and drove it back home, and that was some trip. But I'll never forget when we stayed there in the Black Hills, and after our trip across western South Dakota, which was a desolate country at that time, and the water from Chamberlain to Kadoka was nothing but alkali. And that was an interesting experience in our young life. I was 16 and he was 14. I remember very definitely about doing that.
Now, where'd your folks think about this?
Well, there wasn't much. They really didn't know how far we were going to go. We just went.
Oh, yeah.
and they had a premonition where we were going, but they didn't think that old car would ever make it.
Right, they thought,
And,
they won't be going long.
And the crankshaft was flat, so it would knock out the main bearing. The main bearing was flat, so we'd have to put in fresh ball bearings. I mean fresh, well, what did they call it in those days? Babbitt in the crankshaft, in the pistons, in order to get the thing going again. And I remember we had to stop at least 3 times or 4 times to send back to South Dakota to get new Babbitt for our pistons that fit onto the main crankshaft. And that's the way we made it.
Now, when you say you sent back for them, what does that mean?
What?
You said you sent back for them.
Oh, to the dealer, the Chevrolet dealer, wherever they were. And then in all those, in that day and age, the cars oftentimes would develop a flat crankshaft, and they'd have to put in new bearings in the pistons, and so we'd have to call, or somehow or another we'd stop, and get some new pistons, new Babbitt to put into the pistons, the rods that were running the pistons.
So, do you have any idea how long you were gone?
Oh, we were gone about 15 days. It took a long time to get up there. And by the time we got home, the car was running pretty good.
So, it didn't last very long, but then you did stop and fix it. And then
We had to fix it.
Instead of turning back.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience. I'll never forget that.
That was funny.
That was my brother and another kid. His name.
Oh, yeah?
Another boy went with us. He was the one that had some relatives up in the Black Hills, and we took him along with us.
Oh, okay, so you went up to visit his relatives too. Did you see them? Did you make it to his relatives' place?
What?
Did you make it to his relatives' place?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
But I think that's where they were doing the bootlegging. I'm sure.
Oh, okay. Now the bootlegging, where they were brewing some whiskey or something.
They were brewing
distilling.
about a block away,
Distilling.
and then they'd take the beer. That's what they used.
Oh, beer.
And they'd carry it from that manufacturing place over to the house and drink it there.
Yeah. So they were having a party.
Yeah. That was one weekend.
Yeah.
And we were wondering why they were running back and forth so much. That was unusual.
Yeah. Now this was the beer, of course. Beer was legal in South.
No,
Dakota.
it was illegal.
Oh, was it?
Oh yes, that was before the. Oh, I don't remember just what day it was, but I was 16 and my brother was 14.
Now the prohibition in the United States happened in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
But did you have some prohibition in some states?
Oh, as far as I know, there was. I really don't. I'm not an authority on that. I don't.
But there must have been prohibition in South Dakota before the Nationals.
There was prohibition where we were.
Who taught you to play basketball and football, or did you just learn that in the neighborhood?
All the kids played in the neighborhood, and then we went to high school, and then we learned fundamentals in high school, and then I played football 4 years in college, and so did Leonard.
Yeah.
And I was captain of the basketball team and the football team, both my sophomore year.
Now I understand you took the first plane trip.
Yeah. Our team took the first plane trip to a football game in the history of football, and our picture is walking next to Red Grange in the Hall of Fame.
Oh, it's in the Hall of Fame, and it's next to Red Grange. And what's that?
Our picture was.
What's Red Grange?
Red Grange was one of the greatest football players that ever was.
Okay. Okay. And you took that plane from Omaha.
Yeah.
And then where did you fly to?
35 miles
Uh-huh.
to Fremont, Nebraska.
Uh-huh. And you played them?
And we played Fremont. And as I remember, we played to a nothing to nothing tie.
Really? No field goal or
What?
no field goal or anything?
No, no.
0-0. Huh.
No, after we played 2 rounds, or 4, what do you call it, 4 periods,
Yes.
we'd had enough.
Yeah, that was it.
So we got in the airplane and flew home.
Did you guys wear helmets?
Yes, they weren't very good.
Leather? Were they leather?
They were leather.
Uh-huh.
They weren't, there wasn't padding in them. And the linemen
Uh-huh.
had very few clothes that would protect them.
Uh-huh.
The backfield always had shoulder pads and good equipment, but the linemen didn't have very good clothes, football clothes.
Really?
Yeah.
Because they were just pushing, maybe.
What?
Because they just were pushing instead of hitting. Yeah. Okay. Now, you and okay, so you guys were on the basketball team and the football team, and I know Corrine played sports, didn't she?
Corrine was a good basketball player.
So they had a women's basketball team.
Yes. She was an all-state from Grinnell, Iowa. She went to school 1 year in Iowa.
Oh.
And she played basketball there. She
Okay.
was fast.
Okay. Huh. You grew up in Omaha, right?
Right.
And then you went to college in Lincoln? No, you went to college in Omaha.
Yes, the family lived 2 blocks from the university where we went to get our pre-law and pre-med.
Uh-huh.
And it was right, we were 2 blocks away from the school. And Leonard and I both were athletically inclined, and neither one of us ever paid any tuition or paid for any books. We were just fortunate. We were athletes and we were taken care of.
Oh, really? Athletic scholarship?
Well, it was full of, whatever you want to call it, full of football tuition and basketball tuition.
Okay.
And we were both very fortunate in doing that.
Uh-huh.
And fortunately, the credits were accepted at the Nebraska Medical School and Arizona University. I went to the first law school, 1 year at the University of Arizona.
Okay.
And all of our credits were taken, accepted.
Okay. And when you went to the University of Nebraska at Omaha, right?
At that time, it was just the University of Omaha.
University of Omaha.
And then later it became the University of Omaha, and then later it became Nebraska University at Omaha.
Okay. And did you live at home and go to the
All those
university?
4 years,
Uh-huh.
we lived at home.
Yes. Yes. And
So we got our college education pretty cheap.
that's where you met Darrell, and where you met Grandma, and that's where you met Kareem,
Yep,
right?
yep.
And I know she was staying there, and
I
she
met-
was staying in the
I met-
dorms, right?
I met, as I remember, I met Darrell through Corrine.
Uh-huh.
Corrine was my girlfriend,
Okay.
and then my brother came along and he stole her from me.
Okay.
So I took her best friend,
Okay.
who was Darrell,
Uh-huh.
and I had Darrell as well, that's another part of the story.
Do you have any part of that story that you want to tell that
Oh, I
stands
don't
out
care.
in your mind?
Darrell and I were going together, and then I decided that I wanted to go to law school in Arizona, and she got a job in the Black Hills, so we were separated for a full year.
Okay.
And then when we came back, I went to law school for a year, and she worked in South Dakota. Then she quit that job and stayed with my folks during the last part of the second year, and then we were married, and we were husband and wife during the last year of my law school,
And where did you finish your law school?
Nebraska.
In Omaha.
No, in Lincoln.
Oh, in Lincoln. Okay. Okay. Now, at this point, where were Corinne and Leonard?
Well, Corinne was going to school at Omaha University,
Okay.
and Leonard was going to medical school. Well, he was going to Omaha University for 4 years, and then he went to medical school.
Okay.
And then after he got to medical school, then he and Corinne were married.
Okay. Right. And then, when did they live in Omaha while you
After-
guys were there?
After Leonard got out of medical school, he took a vacation, and then he moved up to Decatur, Nebraska,
Uh-huh.
where I was practicing law. They rented a house and stayed there about a year, and he and I had offices together, sharing the front office with the secretary, and he had no nurse, and I had the secretary, and I was fairly well established, but he wasn't. My father was always a dictator, and he suggested that my brother that he go to Grand Island and take care of Warren Buffett's sister. She was ill, and she was a school teacher, and she was in bad shape physically. And my father was always looking after everybody. So he sent my brother out to Grand Island, and he stayed there about 3 months. And then from there, she recovered. Then from there, he went into the CCC organization, to the Public Health Service. And then he worked to a Public Health Service hospital for a while, and then he enlisted in the Navy.
Okay.
And his first tour of duty was in Parris Island, South Carolina, where he became the first flight surgeon in the history of the history of the Navy.
Oh, okay.
He was in the first class. I want to say that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
he was, and from there, he took his internship in a hospital in Omaha, and that's where our children were all born, in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay.
And he was working there for a couple of years. That's where he got his internship before he left the hospital and started practicing.
Now, from what I remember, you worked on Darrell's father's farm for a while? Did you do
No, Darrell's mother died,
that? Okay.
and her father operated this farm. That's where I went over and got acquainted with her and with her father. And it was a beautiful farm, and I'd like to live there, but Darrell didn't want to live there.
Mm-hmm.
And so she came back to Omaha, and I went off to law school. And I never did live at that farm, but I always wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good farm, and he had good equipment and horses. And right now I've got a copy of the bill of sale when he sold his horses and equipment at the time that the farm was sold.
Uh-huh. Okay. I would like to see that someday.
I'll show it to you.
Now, you set up in Tekamah, and were your daughters born in Tekamah?
They were all three born in Omaha,
In Omaha, and then you moved to
in
Decatur.
Emmanuel Hospital. And then Ann and I think all three were born in Omaha, and then they moved to Decatur. And I lived in Decatur for 6 years, and then I became county judge of Burt County, which was a very, very wealthy farming community.
Mm-hmm. And then, in this story I've heard before, but I want to hear it again, and that is, you knew somebody, I think, tell me if this is right, did you know somebody in Oregon? And then that's why you decided to move out?
One of my best friends was in the Army, and he and I consulted with each other during the war, and we corresponded. Finally, I found out that he was going to move to Oregon.
This is John Chat?
Yes,
Okay.
and he was coming from the service, and he was going to establish himself in Oregon. Well, I had always wanted to move to Oregon. I'd heard lots about it. So on the 4th of July in 1946, I came out and bought a house. And then I said, now, Drell, we're going to move to Oregon on August 4th. Sell our house and get out here and move to Oregon, which I did. I was very homesick, and I wanted to go back to the Cayman, but Drell said, no, you moved us here, we're going to stay here. And Orville Chatt wanted me to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I went into business together, and we got along good.
Mm-hmm.
I considered him one of my, well, I just considered him as a father. And while he was in
John Chatt.
John Chatt's father.
Yes, John Chatt's father was Orville.
What?
Was John Chatt's father named Orville?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And he was a lawyer.
Yes, he was a lawyer. He had been county judge where I was county judge. Then there was another man came in there and served several terms. And while I was practicing, I was county judge, Orville was practicing law. And we became good friends. And then when the war came along, seriously, he decided to enlist, and he went to Africa. He was a colonel, and he was kind of an instructor to the Navy and the flyers.
Now this is John Chatt, right?
John Chatt's father.
Oh, Orville was the one that went in the Navy?
Yes.
Oh. What was John Chatt doing?
He was in school.
Oh.
And he later went into service.
Okay.
And he was with the bomb crowd that sent off that prepared the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima.
Really?
He wasn't, he didn't pilot the plane, but he worked on the project.
Okay. So both John and Orville were in the service at the same time. So you stayed in Eugene, and you were a judge. You practiced law for a while, and then you were a judge for a while. Right?
Well, I was practicing law for 6 years in Oakland, Nebraska, and then I was county judge for 6 years. As county judge, I could practice law as long as it didn't interfere with my judgeship.
Mm-hmm.
And I was judge there for 6 years.
But then in Eugene,
I didn't practice law much because I was pretty busy with my county judge job, and I had an office in the courthouse, and the courthouse used me a lot in conducting their business. But I also handled all the criminal law and serious legal problems of the county as county judge.
Okay. But when you came to Oregon, then you were a lawyer for a while, and then you were also a municipal judge in Oregon too?
Yes.
Okay. Right, so...
I was here in Oregon from August 4th to January 1st, and then I become a municipal judge. I was appointed.
Okay. Okay.
We were in the courthouse, and we lived a block from the courthouse, and it was about 1942, and word came that there was a big tornado coming towards our town. Well, we were told to leave all the windows open so the wind could blow through, but I didn't want to do that, so I closed all the windows, and we got in the car. Went home, got Drell and the 3 girls, and we headed for the tornado. And we went out quite a ways, maybe 10 miles toward the tornado, wanting to see it. We saw it coming, and on the edge of a tornado, there's generally a rainstorm. So we were on a gravel road, and it was kind of slippery. I finally got the car turned around, and the tornado came into Kama right after me. We went to our house, and the tornado hit the north part of town, about 2 blocks from where we lived. But it did a lot of damage all over the town. For instance, next door to us was a great big house, and there was a man that was flooded. He was drowned, and he was washed up onto the porch of this big old house. Well, the tornado did a lot of damage in this town, about 23 or 400 people, and it tore up everything there that it hit. Out in the country, it hit a lot of farm equipment, turned tractors over. They rolled some of those big tractors over, and it was a very, very devastating experience. Well, we survived. Then next day, everybody closed their doors and started scooping water and mud out of their basements, because this tornado came down what was known as Tekema Valley, and it washed a lot of mud and water into town. The town itself was kind of on a delta, and it was right at the mouth of Tekema Creek. So for about 3 or 4 days, everybody pitched in, and we helped each other scoop that mud and water out of the basements and help them with their houses that had been damaged or destroyed. It was a very interesting experience, and we took moving pictures of it, but I don't know where they are now. I think we destroyed them when we moved here. But we had a good picture of that tornado, and I'll never forget that experience.
So, was it like a twister that as it moved through, it would cover a very narrow path, but very devastating within that path?
This tornado was probably 3 blocks wide, and it was twisting, of course. That's what does the damage, the worst of the damage. And it was twisting, the wind was twisting real severely, and it just kind of moved like it was hard to say how it moved down the valley and into our town, but that's what happened. So then I went back to the courthouse, by the way, and opened up the window so it would cool off in there. And I had no damage in my office whatsoever from the tornado.
Now here, move the microphone down, like that. Okay, you don't want it too close, because it's not this kind of mic. It's supposed to be right there. But what I want to know is, did it tear the roofs off of people's houses?
Oh yes, it tore the roofs out, and when the roof was torn out, then the sides would fall down,
Right.
and it upset a lot of corn cribs and chicken houses, and it upset machinery. It was very destructive.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joan wanted you to tell about this, and I'm thinking about, how old she was at the time, and kind of what she was thinking about it, and it sounds to me like you all got the girls in the car and you guys went toward the tornado.
That's right.
What did Joan think about that? Do you remember what the girls thought about that?
Well, they were not very excited about it. As I was driving toward the tornado, they wanted me to turn around and go back. And finally, they convinced me that I should. So we turned around, but we had a hard time getting the car turned around because the road was slippery. Boy, it was scary. So then we went to town, and we went the opposite direction from the tornado, so we wouldn't get damaged. And then after the tornado, then we had several friends out in the country, and we went out to see what happened to those farms. And windmills and everything were just flattened, destroyed. Tractors were turned over. Those old days, there was a McCormick Deering tractor, steel wheels, and they just turned those tractors right over.
Oh, the tractors had steel wheels on them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I distinctly remember that.
So, why did you want to go toward the tornado?
I wanted to see it.
Right, and you were thinking that if you stayed in town, you might miss it.
I wanted to see it before it came to town, and finally it did. And generally speaking, a tornado goes straight.
Okay.
It don't move around, it goes right straight. And this one was going from the southwest to the northeast.
Okay.
And it hit on the northeast corner of the town. And I would say that it probably destroyed a fifth of the houses in the town.
Uh-huh. Huh. So, it missed your own house, right?
But it missed our house, but we got lots of water from it.
Okay. Did you?
As I remember, I can't tell you for sure, but I think that I went and got Joan out of school. The fact is, I think they let the school out because a tornado generally doesn't move very fast, maybe 5-10 miles an hour.
Okay.
And I think the alert came from another town that there was a tornado coming, and I think they told the children to get out and get home. And I think we went over and got Joan, put her in the car, and were headed for the tornado.
Right. When you came back home, did you have any kind of shelter, or did you just have to stay inside the house?
No, we all stayed in the house.
In the house.
And then after the tornado passed through, as I remember, I went over and opened the windows in the courthouse. I lived only a block from the courthouse. And I went over and opened my windows. And then we went downstairs and started scooping mud and water out. And everybody opened their basement windows. In that country, most everybody had a basement.
Uh-huh.
And it was these basements that got full of water and mud. Sometimes, some places, the mud was a foot deep in the basement. As the flood water came in, it was so full of mud, the mud just settled down. And so we had to shovel the mud out with a shovel and a bucket. And I remember when we heard that it was coming to, it comes to me now, that we had a big old ironing machine, and it was heavy. And I remember, we went down in the basement, and Drella and I lifted that ironing out and put it in the kitchen so that it wouldn't get damaged in this flood.
Right.
Now we see it rained a lot after the tornado, and a lot of the damage was from muddy water.
Okay.
I was president of the Navy League, and I decided, since I heard that there was a Navy ship leaving San Diego and headed for Portland, that I would see if we couldn't get a bunch of kids on that ship. So we got them to stop the ship at Coos Bay, and then we had about 25 or 30 kids, and we got them all loaded up on the ship headed for Portland from Coos Bay. And most of the kids got sick because we were on an old destroyer, and it rocked around quite a little bit. And so we finally got to Portland and just got over into the harbor, and we went around and counted to see if all the kids were there, because we were afraid maybe some of them fell off. But it was quite an experience. I'll never forget that, with that bunch of high school kids. And we finally got them all back up to Portland, and they were all pleased with the trip. But some of them were sick most of the time. But they did recover when we were on it. It was sailing up the Columbia River, where the water was smooth. And that was quite an interesting experience.
So were you in the Navy, or is the Navy League something?
No, I was president of the Navy League of Oregon, which is a commercial civilian branch of the government.
Oh.
It's private. I've got a book here on the Navy League.
Okay.
And then one other time, I took 16 kids to Japan on a Navy ship when I was in the Navy League. And that was quite an experience to keep those kids together when we got to Japan, and before and afterwards. It took 10 days to go over and 10 days to come back, and to keep those kids busy for 20 days. Now when we got to Japan, then they spread out and we got all over the country. The kids did. They stayed together, but we would travel around a lot, and they enjoyed it a great deal. But there was one boy on this trip who was disappeared, and it had us scared to death. And just about the day we were leaving, he came back. He had somehow or another met a priest over there that he knew, and he spent 10 days with this priest traveling around in Japan. Then when he came back, by then we were all together, and we got home with all of our boys accounted for. But that was some experience to take that bunch of kids over to Japan and supervise them in a strange country.
What decade was this?
When was it? Oh, about 1967,
Okay.
66, 67.
That's funny.
I could tell you.
He just went off and
I could tell you a lot about the different places we went to when we were there, but
Oh, in Japan.
I don't think you're interested.
Well, I do.